Giannakopoulos is a former senior editor at the Art in America magazine, a renowned journalist. She is a winner of a National Endowment for the Arts Critics grant and has taught at Parsons School of Design, Pratt Institute, the University of Arts, and the Rhode Island School of Design. Giannakopoulos lives in New York City. She completed her master's degree in art history from the Woonsuk Kim College of Fine Arts at Illinois State University in 1984. She holds a BA from the University of Minnesota School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Koplos has a particular interest in American, Japanese, and Dutch contemporary art and in American contemporary crafts. She has also written about design, architecture, landscape, architecture, theater, and other creative fields, and has reviewed books for several publications. She has published more than 2,500 articles, reviews, and essays in newspaper, magazines, and catalogs in America, Europe, and Japan. She is co-author with Bruce Metcalf, Makers, A History of American Studio Craft, other books in contemporary crafts for which she is solo or contributing author include A Chosen Path, The Ceramic Art of Karen Carnes, and other books including The Unexpected Artist Ceramics of the 20th Century. However, her first book was Contemporary Japanese Sculpture, while living in Japan, where she was the art critic for the Asahi Evening News, an English-language daily newspaper published by the Asahi Shimbun. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Giannakopoulos, and I'm deeply grateful that you're taking this time this evening to speak to all of us. So thank you very much, Janet.
So, to start, what you see here is my mother's photo album, circa 1950, to hint that what you're going to be subjected to is a version of vacation slides, essentially the story of my life in relation to Japan. But I think it's interesting, or at least unusual, that 4 generations of my family have been involved with Japan, at first completely accidentally. And Japan has also played an important role in my professional work. Next slide.
Whoops.
It influenced my direction in ways that I never would have expected. After World War II, my father was in the occupation army, and in early 1950, my mother, my older sister Julie, and I took a ship across the Pacific to join him. Next slide. I would have been about 3.5 then, and I don't remember the trip, but this picture, legend has it, was the celebration as we crossed the international date line. The story also goes that we experienced a typhoon, and practically everyone on board, and certainly everyone in my family, was sick except me. Next slide. We lived in army housing in what was then called Grant Heights in the Tokyo ward of Narimaku. My father was just an enlisted man, but with the Japanese economy not yet recovered from the war, we had maids and houseboys. My mother was probably especially appreciative of the help because my sister Charlotte was born after we arrived in Tokyo. My mother always said that Char was born in Japan, but not made in Japan, because my mother was pregnant on the way over. That seemed funny then when most Japanese manufacturers were cheap things. For years, we would refer to Char as our Japanese sister, which is absurd because she's tall and has green eyes and had blonde hair back in those days. But it's white, as you see her now in the audience here. In the pictures are Hideki and Nobuko. We also remember there being Emiko and Shimako. Supposedly, they taught Julie and me a little Japanese, apparently mostly swear words or insults that we would yell out the window at passersby. When I later went to Japan as an adult, I had this fantasy that at some point, ping, the Japanese that I understood as a child would come back to me. It did not happen. Next slide. an itinerant Japanese photographer came to our quarters, Julie was too afraid to be photographed. I was braver, but I looked pretty wary here. Apparently, I was an adventurous kid because at some point, some other little friends and I decided that we would walk to Mount Fuji. Our parents or the MPs or someone found us before we got very far. Julie went to first grade in Japan, and she can still remember the school song that ends, "Nerima, we hail to thee, to our school across the sea." Next slide. Maybe some of you will recognize where Julie and I were photographed here. It's Nihonbashi, a bridge that was the point from which all distances in Japan were calculated. And that first photograph was before the Tokyo Metropolitan Expressway was built on top of the river that the bridge crosses. 35 years later, we recreated the photo, and you can sort of just barely see between the sculpture and the pillar, the edge of the expressway that's overhead. I think we were only there about a year and a half, probably because the Korean War broke out. So that might have been the end of the story of Japan and me. Except that we grew up, next slide, surrounded by tchotchkes that my parents brought home from Japan. Here's a few of them. A tableau of the elderly couple who got their wish for a child when Momotaro was born from a peach. An ivory, I think, interpretation of the famous "Speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil" carving at the Tokugawa Memorial Shrine at Nikko. A replica of a honey bucket that carried human waste to fertilize the fields. A decorative hagoita, like those used as a bat in a badminton-like game. And some kind of a drinking game with cups of various sizes and dice. And I hope maybe someone in the audience knows just what this is. Was it genuinely Japanese, or was it something made for the tourist trade? I don't know. We also had a set of kokeshi dolls and more unusual things, such as, next slide, a wooden platter in the shape of a fish. There's a shoe behind it in this picture, which gives you a sense of the size. Years later, I asked someone to translate the writing on the back, and I learned that it was a festival souvenir for a small town near Osaka. I have no idea how my parents ended up with this. Another link to Japan, which indicates my mother's attachment to the aesthetics of Japan, next slide, is a set of dishes that she bought in the US after we were back. These were made by Winfield China, one of the small California potteries that flourished during and after the war until German and Japanese ceramics began to be produced again, at which time nearly all the California companies went out of business. We used these regularly, but it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that there were variations in the painting on the plates and bowls that showed that the dishes were hand painted. You can see darker areas of green that show where the decorator's brush was fully loaded. Certainly the bamboo motif was what attracted my mother and undoubtedly reminded her of Japan. We moved on from there, living over the years in Oregon, California, Washington, and Alaska, the Pacific Rim states that look over their shoulders toward Asia. Next slide. So there were distant echoes of Japan, such as Banodori festivals, especially in Seattle, where I also had classmates of Japanese descent. But Japan became really just a fond memory for our family. However, for me, contemporary crafts became a new link to Japan. I slowly became aware of the Japanese influence on American pottery. I think, next slide, first from stumbling across Craft Horizons magazine as a young adult. It became more real to me when I went back to school to finish my BA. I was living in Minnesota then, and don't try to keep my itinerary straight because I have lived in 13 states and 2 foreign countries so far. Next slide. At the University of Minnesota, I majored in journalism, and for a special class on magazine writing and production, we developed a one-shot magazine on the crafts revival. It was 1976, the bicentennial year. That project introduced me to, next slide, Warren Mackenzie, a professor of ceramics at the U. He coached our class on what crafts were active in Minnesota, what the history was, and aesthetic questions. He told us his own lineage of he and his wife having apprenticed with Bernard Leach in Cornwall, England, in the 50s, when they realized that art school hadn't taught them enough to actually be potters. Leach had published, next slide, a potter's book in 1940. It was both a practical guide and an art historical introduction to the ceramics of Asia and England. Next slide. Leach had learned to make pots while living in Japan as a young man. Here you see him in his 40s on one of his many, many return trips to Japan with the potter Hamada Shoji. And I'm going to use Japanese order in all these names. Leach had met Hamada when Hamada was still a student at a ceramics technical college. And when Leach moved back to England around 1920, Hamada went with him and stayed a few years. Hamada subsequently established his own pottery in the traditional pottery village of Mashiko. They remained friends as long as they lived. Next slide. But significantly, in Japan, Leach also became friends with a young philosopher, Yanagi Soetsu, who later founded the Mingei movement and the Nihon Mingeikan, the Japan Folk Crafts Museum in Tokyo. Japan had been westernizing, and people had little interest in old-fashioned crafts at the time. As a result, Yanagi was able to collect folk crafts for little or no money. Later, Leach introduced the West to Yanagi's ideas when, after Yanagi's death, he helped to translate some of his essays in art criticism and adapted them as a book titled The Unknown Craftsman, A Japanese Insight into Beauty in 1972, and this is still in print. Hamada, the potter who you also see here, was later honored as a living national treasure by the Japanese government. He is constantly associated with Mingei, but he was not a folk artist. The Mingei-kan used to show his work and Leach's ceramics in a room labeled Artist Friends of Mingei, or something, some wording like that. Next slide. So I learned this background when living in a state that later was jokingly called Mingei Soda. It was a state with a strong pottery culture established by Warren Mackenzie and his students and their students. One of the most wonderful pottery events in the whole US, even today, is the St. Croix Valley Pottery Tour, in which 7 potteries located just an hour north of the Twin Cities hold a big event on Mother's Day weekend. This year, it was the 33rd time. They invite other potteries from across the country and sometimes abroad, so there may be as many as 60 exhibiting potters. It is a joyous event. One of the host potters is Jeff Astrike, who you see here, who studied with Mackenzie and then went to England to apprentice at the Leach Pottery. One of the regular exhibitors is Randy Johnston, who went to Japan to apprentice with Shimaoka Tatsuzo, who had apprenticed to Hamada. So you see there were many threads of connection between Japan and Minnesota. I started art writing, in parentheses, in quotes, about the time I finished journalism school, but I felt entirely unqualified, never having taken a single art or art history class. I started writing at the campus newspaper, writing up news and doing interviews. Next slide. Prophetically, the first interview I published was with Warren Mackenzie. Gradually, I did more reviewing. I wrote factually about what I saw and subjectively about how I made sense of it. I began freelancing reviews to the Minneapolis Evening Paper, and I also wrote for many other small art or craft publications. We moved away from Minnesota to Illinois, and I began writing for the New Art Examiner based in Chicago. Then while we were living in Peoria, next slide, I decided to go back to school for a master's degree in art history. The closest program was at Illinois State University in Normal, about an hour's drive away. I enjoyed my time there, but it's ironic, considering what came later, that the program offered no Asian art history courses. But I did some independent study in the crafts medium, since they were not included in the art history courses either. I picked up a little Asian ceramic knowledge from that, but not a lot. I also pursued my thinking about crafts by making it the subject of my master's thesis. When I submitted it, it did not look as bad as it does in this picture. It was in a fire, so I'm lucky that it survived at all, even in this mildewed condition. There was another move, this time to Atlanta. Next slide. I found a venue where I could write about art, but I also found a full-time job as an editor of a trade magazine for art supply stores, as it happened. And then one day my husband came home from work and said, "What would you think about moving to Japan?" Now, you may think that sounds wonderful, but my response was, "What would I do there? You'd be at work and the kids would be at some kind of school, and what would I do?" Well, bless his heart, he blackmailed me by asking, would I really deny our children this incredible cultural opportunity? So I gave in, and it turned out to be fabulous for me. We settled, next slide, in Shibuya-ku, specifically Uehara Nichome. If you can read katakana in tiny print near the bottom center of this map, you'll see Kopurosu marking our house. Soon I was scoping out 4 English language newspapers that were published in Tokyo at the time, and little by little I was finding contemporary art galleries. When we moved there, I was aware of prints and ceramics, but I didn't even know if there was contemporary art in Japan. And when I asked people about art, they would usually direct me to places, next slide, that sold charming prints that gaijin would buy as souvenirs. But eventually I found a gallery in a Ginza sub-basement that had a whole wall of postcard announcements of contemporary shows outside its door on a bulletin board. Confession, I stole a whole bunch of the cards so I could figure out where the galleries were. I was taking Japanese lessons at a school for foreigners, 9 hours a week, and I also hired a tutor to come to our place. But before long, I gave it up because I just wanted to be out on the street seeing stuff. I did gradually learn to recognize common kanji in place names and people's names, and I could read the phonetic kana, of course. But that was just enough to get by, and I never learned to speak above the most rudimentary survival level, which makes me very sympathetic to immigrants in America, by the way. I did go on employing the tutor for a long time, but only to do rough oral translations of catalog essays for me, because nothing was published in English at that time, or sometimes to translate when I talked with an artist. We still keep in touch 40 years later. My mother and sisters were quick to plan a trip back to Japan because we were there, which is the explanation of that second photo of Julie and me at Nihonbashi. I didn't know my way around the country yet, and when we tried to take a trip to Kamakura, next slide, we got on the wrong train with our train passes and didn't know it until we arrived at the other end of the line at the Pacific coast. This became a celebrated family oops story that we like to laugh about, and the goofy picture still memorializes it on a wall at my sister Julie's home. Next slide. I joined the College Women's Association of Japan, an opportunity to meet Japanese professional women, and I helped to edit the annual thematic publication that they put out, and also served as a judge for their print show. But more important than that, next slide, I began writing weekly reviews for the Asahi Evening News and met Timothy Harris. He is a longtime British resident of Japan, married to a Japanese pianist, and is primarily a literary critic. But he was the arts editor at the Asahi Evening News and was an inspiration because he was such an intelligent and demanding reader, I really had to think hard to meet his standards. I also did book reviews, which increased my collection of books about Japanese arts, many of which I donated to the Study Center a few months ago. The review at the right, by the way, is the work of Li Yufan, although if you can read that, you see that the Asahi used names in Western order. Next slide. Li is a Korean man, long resident in Japan, who in recent years, I'm happy to say, has been picked up by major international galleries. He's one of the artists collected at Dia Beacon in the Hudson Valley, although unfortunately his work is not currently on view there. Another artist who is currently featured in the huge exhibition space at Dia Beacon is Suga Kishio. Both men were associated with a Japanese art movement called Monoha. The name translates as the school of things, but I always thought it should be called the school of stuff. They argued that the material made as important a contribution to the meaning and value of the artwork as the artist did. In Lee's paintings like this, what you see is the simple fact of using up the amount of paint loaded into a brush, drawing it down the canvas until it runs out. He also made sculptures which are equally literal. For example, an enormous boulder that sits on a sheet of glass that has cracked from the weight of the boulder. Suga's sculptures take a great variety of forms. There are 6 large ones on view at Dia Beacon. I would say that they usually have to do with a connection in some way. And Dia, in their written material about the show, uses the word contingency and points out that many of his early works use the word situation in their titles. And I think that's a helpful way to think about them too. They did a good work of analyzing the work so thoroughly. But back to my story. So I soon began working at the Mainichi Daily News in addition to the Asahi, but not as a writer. First, I was a proofreader and then an editor of news pages, and finally an editor of the Monday Arts page, where I could assign stories on subjects I wanted to know more about. That was a treat. And then I got my foot in the door at Art in America. Next slide. I submitted over the transom, as they say, unsolicited, a review of a pair of exhibitions by Kawamata Tadashi. After a few reviews were published, I wrote my first feature article on contemporary Japanese art for the magazine. My last professional accomplishment in Japan, next slide, was to write contemporary Japanese sculpture, which was published by Abbeville Press after we were back in the US in 1991. That was an amazingly lucky process. In those days, pre-internet, you would check a book called Writer's Market that would tell you what different book publishers or magazine publishers were looking for. Abbeville was not listed in Writer's Market, so I wrote them a letter saying I had a manuscript about contemporary Japanese sculpture, and if I were to pitch it to them, did they want an outline or a chapter or what? They replied and said, send it. And they accepted it. It was just that easy. It isn't always that easy to find a publisher. Ask me. The book intended to be comprehensive in representing approaches to sculpture in Japan at the time, but it was illustrated only with work that I had come across during my time there. When I add all this up, it seems very busy. And of course, I had my American family to occupy me as well. But I heard some people complain about feeling alone in Japan, feeling so obviously foreign. Yes, clearly I would never be mistaken for a Japanese, but the sense of being outside the culture while being in the midst of it didn't bother me at all. I think it fit very well into being a writer, a person who necessarily spends a lot of time alone, and even more into being a critic, which means that I'm always analyzing. I found being an observer fascinating. Next slide. But I haven't mentioned one other influential experience in Japan. Because of meeting Warren Mackenzie in Minnesota, I knew about the Mengekan, the Folk Crafts Museum, started by Yanagi Soetsu and his friends. As it happened, the place where we lived was just a short walk from the Mingekon. Soon I went there and I asked the receptionist if I could volunteer as a docent. She didn't speak much English, and she met my question with one of those deer in the headlight looks. I was to learn that there was no tradition of docents in Japan at that time. She didn't know what I was talking about. She phoned to the back office and another woman came out. Next slide. Oh, this should be one.
What?
Okay. That's another view of the Mingekon. Next slide, please. Okay, the woman who came out from the back office was Utsumi Teiko, who was called the Mingekon's international director. She had gone to college in the US and had lived with her husband and children in several states. As she told me about this background, the last one she mentioned was New Jersey. She paused and then said, New Jersey. So I knew she was not a typical Japanese woman. She was a kick, actually, great sense of humor. So, next slide. That began a process in which she and I and one of the curators would walk around a new exhibition, and Teiko would informally translate what the curator said, and I took notes. And then I would write up an explanatory page in English that would be posted in the gallery for the duration of the exhibition. The director, next slide, the director of the Mingekon at that time was Yanagi Sori, the son of the founder. Sori was an industrial designer, and he said that industrial design was the Minge of today because it was made for everyday use and was economical. He seemed to be an incorrigibly cheerful person, and I doubt that you could find a picture of him in which he is not smiling. Next slide. He wrote several books on underappreciated crafts that interested him, including origami designs, firemen's emblems, and textile designs by Serizawa Keisuke. Teiko and I worked collaboratively on the English parts, a very minor and uncredited part of the books that in a way I shouldn't even mention, except that it was such a pleasure to be doing something, to be working with him in this way. Every year, the Mingekon gave me a gift. Once it was a ceramic bowl in the traditional style, and once it was a set of lacquer saucers. Next slide. And once it was a carafe designed by Sori. So you see another of his beautiful designs. My involvement with the Mingekon was just a volunteer activity. And I suppose it doesn't sound like a big deal, but somehow for me, it was deeply personal and so lasting in its impact that when I gave 8 boxes of books about Japan to the study center, I did not include books about Minge and people associated with it. I just wasn't ready to let them go. I think part of the reason that Minge spoke to my pre-existing interests, my biases, if you wish to say it that way. Next slide. I've always been interested in the tactile and the imperfect. Even in my writing about American art, I'm less interested in the major figures and more interested in emerging or forgotten artists. So the idea of the unknown craftsman serving a community appealed to me from day one. And I've read and heard enough about the principal figures, Leach, the senior Yanagi, and Hamada, that they seem like friends to me. Next slide. Feeling is augmented a little by having visited the home of Kouai Kanjiro, a ceramist who was also associated with the Minge movement. His home in Kyoto is now a house museum. It's warm and intimate and comfortable, and I can imagine all of them sitting around the fire or around the big table. When they met, they were young men who cared about beauty and usefulness, and that's meaningful to me. Next slide. After 4 years, our time in Japan came to an end. We moved to Stamford, Connecticut, close enough to New York City to commute. I applied to 3 of the big 4 art magazines, skipping Art Forum because I didn't like reading it. Art in America was my best bet because I was already writing for them, but I had also done a piece or 2 for Arts magazine, but there were no vacancies. However, a few months later, I got a call asking if I could fill in for an Art in America editor who was ill. for a couple of weeks, they said. But in fact, this was the late 80s and he had AIDS and he never came back. For Art in America, I was working as an editor, but I continued to write on a freelance basis. And I regularly wrote about Japanese art and artists, among other things. I had to make sure that my colleagues understood that one Asian country was not the same as another, and the fact that I knew Japan was due to the luck of living there, not because I was any kind of expert. For quite a while, I went back at least once a year to see special shows, to write a theme article, such as the one about Japanese women artists, and to review the best shows that I happened to see at the galleries when I was there. I occasionally reviewed books for Art in America as well, and could add to my library various books that Art in America did not want for theirs. I was there in one capacity or another for 18 years. My attachment to Japan continues on a more ordinary level. Now I only get back once every few years, and it's just for pleasure. I still get announcements from a bunch of galleries in Tokyo and from the Japan Foundation and so on. Next slide. Both my daughters graduated from the American School in Japan, which is located in the Tokyo suburb of Chofushi. And surprisingly enough, both are married to American men who they first met in high school there. A few years ago, my older daughter, who is an educator, had the opportunity to work at an international school in Tokyo, and her husband was willing to go as what they call the trailing spouse, the one without a job, because he wanted his kids to experience Japan as he had. As a consequence, 2 of their children are also graduates of ASIJ. I had little regret that my daughter moved so far away, because that made it easier to go back to Japan because there was a place to stay. So it ends up that 4 generations of my family have lived in Japan, mostly by happenstance, but it holds a big place in our hearts. Next slide. One more family aspect. In a sense, all 4 generations of us traveled on the Nakasendo, which you may know is the ancient route through the mountains between Kyoto and Edo, which is today Tokyo. My mother died in the 1990s when she was living in the Seattle area. My sisters and I spread some of her ashes on Issaquah Creek, and I took the rest and dropped some into the Mississippi with my older daughter, who was living in Minnesota then, and some into Catskill Creek, which feeds into the Hudson, with my younger daughter, who was living in New York then. If you're thinking about the watersheds in your mind, those creeks and rivers lead to the Pacific Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic Ocean. We joked that my mother always did like to travel. I still had some of her ashes, and frankly, I found it rather comforting to have her with me in a way. But when my older daughter was living in Tokyo and my younger daughter's daughter, her niece, was staying with her for a few months, we made a plan to walk on a section of the Nakasendo. Next slide. I brought the rest of my mother's ashes with me, and at a beautiful spot in the woods, I scattered the last of her ashes in Japan. Nowadays, I'm mostly working on books, although I frequently review ceramics for Ceramics Art and Perception magazine. Next slide. My last book, which was published right before COVID, so it pretty much disappeared without a trace, is What Makes a Potter? Functional Pottery in America Today. It has wonderful interviews with 50 potters, and I highly recommend it, not celebrating my own contribution, but because what they had to say is so wonderful. I have a new book coming out in October. It's a collaboration with the artist Carol Eckert, who publishes a beautiful blog called Contemporary Basketry, which represents work from basketry artists around the world, including Japan. The book includes things from tabletop size to architectural scale baskets that you can walk into. Next slide. And my partner and I recently returned from a month-long stay, mostly in Tokyo, where, among other things, we visited my old friend, Sekijim Hisako, who is included in the basketry book. Next slide. We also visited the sculptor Yamada Keiko, who I hadn't seen since 1989, but we managed to recognize each other in the Machida train station. So I suppose I can say that you can take the girl out of Japan, but not Japan out of the girl, because Japanese objects, art, taste, and food continue to be important in my life. But for some reason, I always spelled, let me try that again. Next slide. But for some reason, I always felt more nearly Shinto than Buddhist. Maybe because the idea of gods occupying wondrous natural features just seem inherently right to me. And here I stop.